This morning, we are joined by an OCBCer that many of you will remember from his time here at OCBC while he was a student at Harvard Divinity School. And today he's joining us from his home in North Carolina, Justin Davis.
Hey there, OCBC. It's so good to see you. I hope you're all staying safe and doing well. So Cody invited me to give a few brief thoughts on Acts chapter 12 as we go through and read it together. So here, for the first time in the book of Acts, this is one of the first times that one of the original 12, aside from Judas, is martyred for their faith. So the story starts out on a little bit of a dark note. As we go through, we see the story of Peter being miraculously freed from prison after the death of his friend James. We see how he's received by his friends back at home. And then we also see the untimely death of Herod. Now, I'm not going to go over the entirety of the text, but rather I want us to keep something in mind as we read through this text. While this tale might seem dark on the outset, I want us to take a moment to read it perhaps through a little bit of a different light. You see in this chapter, despite all of the darkness and death and imprisonment, we also see some interestingly comic tropes used here in the story. Many scholars have noted that Peter's escape from prison sort of parallels Jesus' resurrection. And if the gospel itself is meant to be read as a comedy rather than a tragedy, then maybe reading the story in light of the parallel story of the resurrection might help us shed some new light on this narrative. I imagine that the original readers of Acts must have cracked a few smiles while reading this text. And so I just want to point out a few. So one, Herod kept 4 squads of 4 men, since he and the other disciples escaped earlier in Acts chapter 5. And yet Peter walks out without encountering any resistance. The angel who rescues him wakes him up by kicking him and says, "Hey, get up." Rhoda answers the door, and instead of opening it and welcoming Peter in, she's so overcome with joy and excitement that she goes off and tells the disciples, leaving Peter still out there. And then you have the disciples not believing her. Even though they're ceaselessly praying, as we see in verse 5, they don't believe her. Just as the original women who told the disciples of Jesus' resurrection didn't believe them either. And then they're astonished when they see him, and Peter is begging them to stay quiet so he doesn't get caught. We see Herod, despite all of his political machinations, is struck down by the Lord just as miraculously as Peter was freed. And here, I think we see an important sort of comic inversion of roles. In a carnivalesque fashion, a young servant girl is the one who receives the good news of Peter's return. And yet at the same time, the king in all of his royal robes is laid down low and among the worms. So here we see a darkly comic reiteration of the resurrection narrative. Here, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. So as we go through, try to keep some of these things in mind, the sort of comic dimensions that this text might be offering us, to be able to read it in a little bit of a different light. And in this time of uncertainty and darkness, couldn't we all use a little bit of a good laugh, remembering that God's hand is still at work, even amidst our current condition? I think this narrative can help us remember that laughing in the midst of a dark, uncertain, and seemingly contingent world might just be one of our most sacred tasks. It's good to see you. Y'all stay safe. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. I love you all.